Before we dive in, I want to thank today's sponsor, Searchality, for supporting the Independent School Moonshot podcast. When I ask a school leader to name their top 3 headaches, recruitment, retention of staff inevitably comes up. Talent shortages, costs, and the need for continuous recruitment strategies are some of the current challenges you may face. Searchality is here to help schools minimize the pain and the cost of recruiting faculty and staff with a smart platform built exclusively for K-12 schools. Built and run by a team of people who understand schools and hiring, Searchality works to make it easier for the people who oversee and make the recruitment decisions. With a strong database of talented teachers, both in the US and internationally, Searchality also makes the application process work for candidates, matching vacancies with candidates' qualifications, experience, and career goals. Integrating easily with school website, onboarding is a matter of hours. Searchality eases the pain of the HR teams, heads, and business managers by drastically reducing the time and cost involved in faculty recruitment, while leaving candidates with a positive application experience. To learn how Searchality can support your school, visit searchality.com. That's SearchAlity.com. And now on to the show. Hi there, my friend. I'm Peter Barron. Welcome to today's episode of the Independent School Moonshot podcast. I am thrilled to be joined by Amol Tripathi. So I got to tell you, I met Amol, I guess it was in November of 25. And we were at an event for AIMS, which is the Association of Independent Schools in Maryland. And I had given a talk, and then Amol gave a talk. And he talked about this concept of creating anti-fragile institutions. And I got to tell you, I've heard a lot of talks in my career. And the way Amol laid out this framework so that schools can strengthen their organizations and be competitive in increasingly competitive markets really was amazing. So much so that he was kind enough to come into Moonshot Lab, lead a session there with my members. But, you know, after we were done with that, I was like, we got to continue to amplify this because I think it's such an important construct. And so he's here today to share more. But before we do that, Amol, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Peter. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm very excited that we met, and it's been a great journey since then.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm excited to dig into everything today. But before we do that, can you introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your coaching services?
Sure. Yeah. So like I said, Peter, pleasure. It always is. So I have a background in worlds that rarely intersect. I've worked in government, I've worked in finance, startups, and more recently, independent schools. And that's what really made the work I do. So the work I do, I'm a business coach and I do business advisory work. It's been very rewarding because I'm able to pull from the different contexts where I've seen strategies work and then introduce them to leadership teams in areas where those ideas are pretty new and novel. Quickly on my background, since you asked, I studied econ at Harvard during undergrad, dual-tracked real estate and entrepreneurship at Wharton during business school. And before that, one of my favorite roles was working at the New York City Economic Development Corporation during Michael Bloomberg's mayoral administration. And so my role actually was all about taking big ideas from concept to reality. And every single project I worked on came to life. And that's what really got me into this whole idea of entrepreneurship. And, you know, I was on the ground guy for a project called Game Changers for New York City, which eventually became Cornell Tech on Roosevelt Island, that actually opened its doors to its first graduate students in 2017. So after business school, you know, I spent about a decade rising the ranks to become a managing director at Hines, which is one of the world's largest commercial real estate firms. And I managed the development of one of Northern Virginia's tallest office towers and navigated several projects that occurred during that time through market shifts, through recessions, through the unexpected. And I'll tell you, real estate really teaches you about volatility because you're making 10-year bets in markets that change quarterly. And so today, it leads into the work I do, right, with executive teams and leadership teams. As I told you before, as those teams are leveling up on 12 to 24 month goals in environments that are uncertain, right? So that's also how we work together. In terms of education, I work as the investment committee chair and a board trustee at the primary day school in Bethesda, Maryland, which is how I got involved in independent schoolwork. What I've actually found is that so much of the cutting edge thinking about organizational development and growth that happens in the private sector, whether that's through venture capital, through startups, institutional investing, very little of that seems to reach independent schools. I know you're on a mission to change that, Peter. I'm certainly excited to be part of that. And schools are really mission-driven organizations that deserve better strategic frameworks. So I'm excited to be here to help try to bridge that gap.
And you talk about this concept of developing organizations that are anti-fragile, right? And I know that came out of a book that that kind of lays it out in detail. But what really struck me was when I'm hearing you speak about this topic, and you'll define it in a second, I'm sure, but you really have a sharp distinction between resilience and becoming anti-fragile. And when I look out at the kind of broader landscape of independent schools, and this is part of what I talk about when I'm at conferences and things like that, but there are just a lot of disruptive forces facing independent schools right now. It's economic forces, it's enrollment forces, like all these things, right? What you talk about is like, how can schools, instead of just trying to weather disruption, like what does it really mean to move beyond bouncing back, instead grow stronger because of stress? Because there is opportunity, and even if it's like you're feeling the stress, there's opportunity to flip that into, new pathways for your school. So like, how does that work for you?
Yeah. So what you just said is sort of the core insight that really changes everything, right? Bouncing back and growing stronger because of stress. So I want to be precise. You asked about resilience. You asked about anti-fragility. We should really be precise about the distinction between the two for all the people who are listening today, right? So to do that, we really need to understand what anti-fragility means. So to illustrate, let's think about three objects under stress. So we can start with the wine glass under pressure. It shatters because it's fragile. Now let's talk about a rock under pressure. It's what the book defines and what we call robust. It resists damage and it survives. But here's the thing. Even rocks erode over time under constant pressure. So robustness means you can withstand shocks, but you're not gaining from them. You're sort of just enduring. Now, let's turn our attention to a muscle. A muscle is anti-fragile. It doesn't just endure stress. It rebuilds stronger because of that stress. The stress itself triggers growth. And that is the key insight. Resilience is about bouncing back to where you were. It's the rock. And for a long time, that's been the gold standard in school leadership. I've seen heads of school and others on boards ask each other, how do we sort of weather this storm and return to normal? But as we talked about just a second ago, under constant pressure, even rocks erode. So anti-fragility is fundamentally different. It requires you positioning yourself so that volatility and disruption make you stronger. When enrollment dips, for example, you discover that your auxiliary revenue programs that had some hidden upside are more valuable than you thought, given the unforeseen circumstances. Or when a key faculty member leaves, you realize that your new teacher training program actually improves your teaching quality. Or when the markets shift, you find that experimental programs become your competitive advantage. Nassim Taleb coined the term anti-fragility. And he pointed out correctly that all of the natural systems that survive over centuries, whether that's ecosystems, immune systems, even markets, they don't just resist stress, they gain from it, which is why they're still around. Our schools should be designed the same way. So the practical implication of us talking about this is this. So instead of asking ourselves, how do we protect ourselves from the next crisis? Anti-fragile schools ask, how do we position ourselves in our portfolio of activities to benefit from whatever happens next, even if we can't predict what that will be. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And what it gets me thinking about, Amol, is that in so many cases, organizations, and this isn't, anybody's listening to this pod knows that, a lot of the pressures that we're feeling in schools, that a lot of our characteristics are, you find them in lots of industries, right? This isn't, a lot about what we talk here is specific about independent schools, but you could translate that to any number of industries.
Mm-hmm.
And so, what I've seen a lot over my career is before before taking action, you're seeking certainty. But yet what you talk about is kind of the opposite, right? Like if you wait for that perfect thing, it actually makes you more fragile. And so if a head of school is listening to this, how can they build confidence in action when the data, when they just have to accept the fact that the data is not going to be complete?
Peter, what you just mentioned is one of like the deepest, sneakiest, least apparent traps that school leaders fall into. And I really do have a lot of empathy for it. As a society and a species, we have this profound aversion to loss, right? Every decision in uncertain environments feels like a potential loss waiting to happen. Like the wrong strategic direction or the wrong hire or the wrong investment. So what do? We seek confidence and conviction before we act. We wait for more data. We form committees. We study the problem longer. But here's the issue. The more uncertain the world is, which is actually our current world, the harder it becomes to separate true signal from noise. So if the entire tea industry is being disrupted, there's really no use in trying to read the tea leaves, right? And since private education is changing so rapidly, if you're able to make what you call a perfect decision with complete certainty, you've definitely waited too long because the window's closed. We also have to accept that we're not able to predict outcomes with certainty. I want that to land for a second to everybody who's listening. We are not able to predict outcomes with certainty, right? Sometimes the best decision we make leads to a bad outcome, and then we think of it as a bad decision in hindsight. Annie Duke talks about this very well in the book Thinking in Bets. Just because one outcome happened doesn't mean it was the most likely. We often incorrectly, attribute good or bad outcomes to the quality of our decision making. Terrible decisions can also produce lucky outcomes. So what actually matters is the quality of our decision making process, not any single result. So, going back to what you asked, how do school leaders build confidence without certainty? You do that by shifting from trying to predict outcomes to building a portfolio of activity that could succeed across multiple possible futures. You don't need to know which future is going to happen. You just need to be positioned to benefit from several of them. The barbell strategy, which we're going to talk about, is exactly that. You're not betting on one outcome. You're protecting your core while making multiple small bets with asymmetric payoffs and asymmetric upside. Some are going to fail, and that's expected. That's expected. I want to get that also across. That's expected. Some of these are going to fail, but the ones that work can transform your institution. Confidence does not and should not come from knowing what will happen, but from knowing that your approach will make the best of whatever situation you end up in.
Yeah. And what that makes me think about is like how as a school can you assess where you are fragile in your institution? And I know you talk about many, like fragility actually hides in plain sight for a lot of folks, right? It could be in your governance. It could be in like kind of a over dependence on a single revenue stream. It could be long-standing assumptions. We've always done it this way, right? Like that's something when we talk about that with heads, they're like, yeah, they shake their head up and down. So for you, like when you're thinking about this, what are the most common blind spots that you see schools missing when they do take that step back and when they do that self-reflection to assess, well, where are we fragile in our schools?
So Peter, you are the expert on schools, but from what I've seen across organizations of different types, the most dangerous fragilities are the ones that feel like strengths until they break. So, I'll walk you through the 4 biggest blind spots I've seen based on my work with schools to date. Although, you may have more, and I'm sure you do, that you can add to the community, right? So first, tuition concentration. It seems like there are a bulk of independent schools that derive a very high percentage of their operating revenue from tuition. It feels normal because everybody does it. But if you ask yourself, if enrollment dropped 15% for 2 consecutive years, which has actually happened to schools, what would you do? Do you have alternative revenue streams that could partially compensate? Most schools don't. They're one prolonged enrollment downturn away from existential crisis. Second, governance speed. I've seen schools where every operational decision requires multiple committee approvals. I do believe that thoughtful governance is important. Boards should deliberate, multiple voices matter, but there's a difference between thoughtful governance and decision paralysis. So why do we care? Because markets move fast. Families make enrollment decisions in weeks, not semesters. And if your governance process takes 6 months to approve a new program, you're structurally fragile against faster competitors. Third, key person dependencies. What happens when your head of admissions leaves, or the development director, or your star teacher in the school's signature program? If any single departure would cripple a major function, then you have fragility hiding in plain sight. Most schools don't have genuine succession planning or pipeline development, from what I've seen. But you may differ, Peter. I'll leave that to you.
I think it's definitely a topic that is gaining a lot of steam, for sure.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
That's good to hear. I'm glad to hear it. And the last that I admit it's kind of subtle, but I see it a lot. I see it across businesses, and I certainly see it within schools, is straight line thinking. When enrollment is down, schools panic and they assume permanent decline. And that posture prevents strategic investment right when opportunities come up. And then when applications are up, schools expand aggressively and assume perpetual growth. But that overconfidence creates structural vulnerability as well that surfaces during downturns. So both of those scenarios that I just mentioned center on straight line thinking, and they're consistently wrong over longer time horizons.
Yeah, I think those are all really great points. Especially, I really appreciate straight line thinking. I mean, I can think of markets where, there was a lot of positive economic momentum in those markets, which then meant independent schools were in a very fortunate position. But what happens when those markets shift? And we're seeing that now. And, did you build up that kind of enrollment resiliency, that strength, that, have you, so that you can kind of lean into whatever kind of period of economic growth or decline that you may be in? Like, you're starting to see that. You're seeing that happen in markets right now. We talked briefly, Amol, about the barbell strategy before. I'd love for you to define that, talk about what it looks like in practice, and just give leaders listening, all right, when do I know if the risky side of the barbell, and you'll just describe that in a second, when is it bold enough?
Yeah, that's very, very important. All right, so let's go there. So the barbell is one of the most practical frameworks I've come across for business leaders in general. So I'm going to be as concrete as I can here so everyone can put it in their mind. So picture an actual barbell, but I want a barbell that you find in a gym, right? But imagine that it's asymmetric. One side is much heavier than the other. Now, most people would look at that barbell, that awkwardly shaped barbell, and think there's something wrong. But in Taleb's framework, that awkward, unbalanced barbell is exactly what we want. The full barbell should be thought of, think of it as financial resource allocation, right? So the heavy side of it, 70 to 80% of your resources should be completely safe. Those are reserve funds that could cover 6 to 12 months of operations, core academic programs with proven demand, stable infrastructure, tenured faculty in key positions. That's the foundation. So when disruption hits, you have a cushion. The lighter side of that barbell, 20 to 30%, of your resource allocation should be genuinely risky. Think of that as innovation labs that are testing new teaching models, experimental programs that might fail, new market exploration with different age groups, alternative schedules, new geographies, or even partnerships, right, with uncertain outcomes. The lighter side is where unlimited upside lives. And now let's talk about the middle. So the middle of the barbell between the two sides, you have to actively avoid that, because the middle represents moderate expansion without reserves backing it. It represents programs that appear safe but are outdated. It's consensus-driven decision-making that's too slow to capture opportunities, and middle-tier positioning that's not premium, not affordable. It's just stuck. So the reason this barbell idea, the concept works in reality, in practice, is asymmetric payoffs. The potential for large gains on the risky side is much greater than the potential losses because you've capped your downside with the safe side. You're never, ever betting the institution. I want to make that 100% crystal clear. You're never betting the institution. So I want to give you a theoretical example to, make it into something that you can think about. So imagine a school that's 95% tuition dependent. So a barbell approach might look like a safe side that's focused on building 12 months of reserves to protect the core academic program. The risky side may involve launching a few experiments. First, a summer enrichment program that's open to the broader community and not just current families. A second could be partnering with local businesses to sponsor a STEM track. Or third, piloting a micro-credential program for high schoolers. So imagine 2 of those experiments might fail, and that's expected. But if one becomes a pipeline for new enrollment, or generates meaningful auxiliary revenue, or differentiates your school from the market, then that's transformation, right? The school leadership did not have to predict which one would work. They just positioned themselves to benefit from multiple possibilities. Right. So here's a gauge quickly to think about whether your risky side is bold enough. Ask yourself, what is the most ambitious experiment our school is running right now? And if you can't name one, then your barbell is definitely too conservative. If everything you're doing feels sensible and low risk, then you're probably playing in the middle, which I mentioned earlier is dangerous.
Yeah. That's probably the place where people are most inclined to go. Mm-hmm. Because it feels safe, but it also feels like there's a little bit of risk. It kind of gets back to the earlier question around, we have to have 100% certainty that something's going to be successful. My guess is that if you're playing in that kind of range, that probably to your barbell example, it probably translates to, you're playing in the middle. So I guess what the barbell construct says to me is that you need to have optionality. And that's an important part, I know, of the anti-fragile toolkit. Where do you see schools relying on a single pathway in revenue, programming, or partnership? What are the first steps that they should be thinking about to really build genuine optionality, like having more options?
Yeah, so this is really, really good question. I want to clarify one thing that you said, right? So barbell strategy, risky side, safe side, right? Safe, you do experiments on the risky side that could lead to unlimited upside because you don't really know what the future holds. Optionality is multiple pathways to the same goal. So it means that if one goal is really important for you, you're not relying on a single pathway. So there's slightly different ideas. And that's why I wanted to say they're different frameworks, but they both work together in, producing anti-fragility, if that makes sense. So
that's good. We're having you on the pod.
I appreciate that. Peter. So optionality, multiple pathways, no single point of failure can destroy your institution. So if your entire model depends on one thing working, one revenue stream, one signature program, or one key partnership, then you're fragile. If any of the several pathways could work, then you're anti-fragile. So you asked where I see single pathway dependency, right? I see it everywhere. Yeah. From a revenue perspective, we talked about tuition concentration already. But even schools that recognize this often have a single quote unquote solution, right? Like an annual fund or or endowment draws. Real optionality means summer programs, facility rentals, consulting services, corporate partnerships, alumni giving programs, community education offerings. So each of those is a small bet, but together they can create multiple pathways to achieve the same objective, right? When one softens, others can compensate. So a reasonable target, if you're starting from zero, is 30 to 40% of your revenue from non-tuition sources within 5 years. It's ambitious, but it's achievable, and it fundamentally changes your risk profile. Now, going back where I see single pathway dependency, from a programming perspective, can families only engage with your school in one way? Is it really just full-time September to June enrollment, or do you offer modular programs? Do you offer multiple entry points throughout the year, or flexible programming for different family structures? It's not about compromising quality. It's about creating more ways for families to say yes, which in really results in more ways for your school to succeed. Now, from a partnerships perspective, again, many schools I've met operate in isolation, almost complete isolation. They don't have university partnerships for advanced coursework. They don't have corporate sponsors for STEM or arts programs. They don't share services with other independent schools. Look, every partnership is a pathway. If one ends, then the others still hold. Remember, the goal is to build a network that can absorb shocks. So, as a first step towards genuine optionality, start with a simple audit, right? For each major function, whether that's revenue, whether that's enrollment, programming, or talent, just ask, how many independent pathways do we have? If one fails, what's the alternative? If the answer is consistently, we don't have one, then you've identified your fragility, right? And if you do that, pick one area and then build a second pathway. It doesn't have to be big. That's just one thing that starts building the muscle of creating options.
Yeah. Let's talk about leadership teams for a second, because I think it's easy to feel stuck in the middle, too cautious to innovate, too stretched to build capacity. Like there's just a lot of things going on. So for them, like what's the simplest starting move you've seen a school take that meaningfully shifts them out of that middle and towards anti-fragility?
Okay, so this is where the rubber meets the road, right? Because feeling stuck in the middle is almost universal.
Yeah.
Gary,
100%.
I hear it constantly, right?
Yeah.
We know we should innovate, but we don't have the bandwidth. We know we should build reserves, but we're already stretched.
Yeah.
Right. So the simplest starting move that I've seen work is creating a protected innovation budget, even if it's small. So here's what I mean, right? One school I spoke with recently had strategic reserves that were idle, right? They proposed taking 10% of those reserves each year as an R&D budget, and they proposed it to their finance committee. Whatever they don't end up using will go back, right? The explicit purpose is experimentation, which means trying things that might fail, but have significant upside potential. That type of experiment works because it creates permission, right? Most schools are paralyzed because innovation feels irresponsible. It feels irresponsible to quote unquote gamble with institutional resources. But a designated innovation budget reframes experimentation as responsible strategic allocation. It's not gambling. It's the risky side of the barbell. The second thing that something like that does, the little small innovation budget, is it creates speed. Because if every new idea requires a full budget cycle and multiple committee approvals, nothing moves. So a protected innovation budget with delegated authority, for example, the head of school can, greenlighting experiments within a cap that's set, lets you really move at market speed. And the last thing it does is it creates accountability. Because when you have a designated budget for experimentation, you have to actually experiment. You have to report back. Here's what we tried. Here's what we learned. Here's what worked. The budget forces action instead of endless deliberation. And the percentage that you do for it isn't magic. 5%, 10%, whatever your context allows. The point is protect the core resources from explore the future resources. That separation is what moves you from stuck to in the middle to actually implementing a barbell.
Yeah. And what I'm hearing here is you're making it a priority.
That's exactly right.
At the end of the day, it's a priority. Last question for you, and this has been awesome. I imagine there are some folks who are listening to this, maybe some heads of school who are, coming to the end of this episode and they're like, maybe we're a little more fragile than we realize. What's the first practical step they could take or should take in the next 30 days to begin building anti-fragile muscles?
This is why I love talking to someone like you, Peter. We're both thinking about the concrete steps that they can actually take, right? So look, next 30 days, one concrete step. Conduct a fragility audit with your leadership team. Block 90 minutes, get your senior team in the room, work through 4 questions. 1, where are we most dependent on a single pathway? Whether that's a revenue source, a key person, a signature program, critical partnership, name it or them explicitly, right? Number 2, what would happen if that pathway failed? Not might happen, would happen. Be honest about the consequences. A lot of us like to play around with honesty on that one. Number 3, what's one thing you guys could do in the next 90 days to create a second pathway? Not a complete solution, just a start, a conversation, a pilot, an exploration. And, here's critical advice. Choose the easiest fragile zone to address, not the most important one. Why? Because the goal is not to solve your school's biggest problem in 30 days. The goal is to get you moving on anti-fragile thinking. You need a win. You need momentum. Start with something you can actually do. Once you've built that bustle, tackle the bigger challenges. 4, I want you to ask yourselves, what's the most ambitious experiment we could run this year that we're not running? Again, if we can't name one, your barbell is too conservative. Write down the answers. That document, for now, is your fragility map. It shows where you're exposed and where to focus. The goal is to see clearly. And once you see where fragility is hiding, the pathway forward becomes obvious.
Amol Tripathi, business coach. This has been fantastic. I appreciate you. I appreciate you sharing. If somebody wants to reach out and contact you, what's the best way for them to do that?
I think the easiest, because it's the shortest, I have a couple email addresses, but Amol, my first name, AMOL, at amol.co, AMOL.co. That's the easiest. I'm also at Amol at focalpointcoaching.com. You can look me up that way as well.
Great. And I'll provide a link to your website. Amol Tripathi, business coach. Thanks again. I really do appreciate it.
Peter, it was a pleasure.